Jewish left means social justice. It means either by consensual or democratic means, or in certain cases by violent means, that you will obtain more justice for the workers, more equality for women, and a better distribution of wealth. Generally, that's the meaning. It has in it values of the Enlightenment, values of equality, and the French Revolution. But there's not just one Jewish left. There's many. That's something that's sometimes overlooked. There's communism, there's socialism, there's anarchism, and there are many other varieties.
I'm Ellen Belshaw.
And I'm Ezell Carter. And you're listening to Episode 3 of Recollections with the JPL, the Jewish Public Library Archives and Special Collections podcast.
If this is your first time joining us, Recollections with the JPL is a weaving of several interviews to tell the stories of the Jewish left in Montreal. Today, we're focusing on social and communal organizations, labor movements, and the early days of communism in Canada. Welcome to Recollections.
Okay, so you know how we do. We just hit record.
So we're halfway through this mini-series.
Yes.
How are you feeling?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. It's so much work. Oh, so much respect to podcast creators out there. No joke.
Yeah, it's been difficult to figure out where to put certain things. I think with the structure we've chosen and the topic we've chosen, we've made it very hard for ourselves, but it's fun at the same time. But there's so many things that could lead down any number of paths, and we have to choose which one we want to take.
Oh, man. And it's trying to give everyone their moment, right? Like their time in the sun. And there's got to be like 100 of these organizations just here, just in Montreal. So it has been a little overwhelming, but also like endlessly fascinating, trying to just taper it down so that we can get it under an hour.
I know. Yeah, and each episode is under an hour, but we spent over an hour with each interviewee. So we're really having to cut stuff out, which is always hard.
I'm actually glad you said that, because something that was really important to us when we started doing these interviews was making sure that after they were done, they were formatted in such a way that researchers could continue to use the full interview. So not just the podcast, but actually being able to go back and look at that original interview as source material. But yeah, man, this is complicated.
Totally.
Oh my gosh. Y'all podcast creators, y'all are some real ones.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the content of today's?
I mean, I know you had some thoughts, especially considering what's going on today and what has been going on here since 2023.
Yeah, this episode's interesting because we talk a lot about labor movements, organizing, activism, things like that. And it's interesting that at the end of 2023, so just a few months ago, there was a record-breaking number of union strikes happening, something that I haven't seen in my lifetime. There were people in healthcare, in education, bus drivers. There were so many different unions striking at the same time, seeking collective agreements. And I think a lot of what's happening in this episode, or the content we cover in this episode, kind of ties to that more recent history too.
Yeah, I know. I recall when we were interviewing particularly Ester Reiter, who is the author of A Future Without Hate or Need, that she kind of made the comment that, this fight is not new, and it's been ongoing. I mean, honestly, probably since the birth of man, right? Yeah. It's always timely, but it feels particularly so right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't have an agenda here, but I'm definitely interested in making these kind of connections through history, like you're saying. And it makes a lot of sense in the most basic way that when people determine that what they are experiencing isn't working for them, that they will start to imagine a better future and then often start working towards that future. And that's a root of what I see through all of these different organizations and groups that we're going to dive into in this episode, and kind of the basis of the whole leftist movement, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So are you ready to dive in?
Totally.
Okay, well, I am particularly happy to share, as is my good friend Ellen, that we are including a special ninth speaker in today's episode. We are featuring some clips from our archives from a 1993 interview with the infamous organizer Lea Roback, conducted by our very own Archivist Emeritus, Eiran Harris.
You'll hear more about Leah and her story interwoven throughout this episode. Pierre Anctil starts us off today.
The immigration figures plummeted. Canada closed its door to immigrants almost totally. Not Jews only, but all immigrants. So for communities like the Jewish community, it severed a very constant and deep link with the countries of origin. And it created a great deal of insecurity, despair, and I would say even people lost faith in the society they were living in, hence the development of left-leaning organizations who of course criticized communism, capitalism very strongly. So that's one element.
At first, they were all part of the arbitering, and you know what the criteria was? If you hated the capitalist system, then you were in. You could be an anarchist, you could be a social democrat, you could be a left-wing Zionist. Everybody fit under that umbrella.
We can loosely, in terms of the Jewish context, talk about three areas of what becomes the Jewish left that is very much in dialogue with the non-Jewish left in Russia and in Western Europe at the time. And that is something like socialists and anarchists on one side, or not on one side, but one group would be kind of a socialist anarchisty group. Another group is socialist and anarchist with cultural nationalism, let's say, which is more of a Bundist take. And then leftist Jews who have a sense of or believe that land or territory is very important for political projects, and which would be more the territorialists or left Zionists. And so the question of what were the political movements of Jews? What were the political movements of Jews in Montreal in the early 20th century? It's helpful to think of these three strands as being ideas that are present or movements that are present. What I would call the socialist or anarchist tendency, one group that kind of comes together as the Arbiter Ring in 1907. The Arbiter Ring, which means workman's circle, was then a Jewish fraternal organization. Based a Jewish workers fraternal organization, and they were quite open in who they allowed into the group. So it included socialists and territorialists, Marxists, social democrats, Bundists, and that's kind of one. The Arbiter Ring, which Hirschman was involved in, starting in 1907, serves as kind of the gathering house for the different strands of Jewish leftists at the time.
But if you go on the cemetery, as Sam and I, you'll recall, Sam, when we were there, you can go on the Workman's Circle Cemetery and see people's graves. They devoted their lives to the working class. You can go on the communist section. They devoted their hammer and sickle on their tombstone. People go nowadays to hear a show, an indie rock show at the Sala Rosa in St. Lawrence. That was the Arbitering, the Workman's Circle. Why did they build that? Because for the same reason all these Jewish mutual aid societies started. Because they did not want working class Jews. The Arbitering on St. Lawrence, they said, we're going to have a dance. We want workers to meet other workers. The children of you're going to have a gym. We want working class Jewish kids to be with other working class Jewish kids. We want courses, working class things, and the Jewish trade unions would often be located in that building on St. Lawrence, where nowadays people go to hear indie rock music and stuff like that, which was built in the Depression. But it was the idea that it's to like build on what Sam was saying, that we want to have cultural organizations, but we want cultural organizations. If we're going to have Jewish cultural organizations, let them be class conscious ones.
The United Jewish People's Order, the Orden der Orden, I think was born in the middle 1930s, and it's not clear to me, having seen something of the documents associated with the organization, just why it was founded, but that it was modeled on existing organizations of the same sort, not on the communist-leaning left, but rather on the democratic socialist left or the Zionist left. It was modeled on those communal organizations. Those organizations have much older roots than the UJPO. But the UJPO, well, borrowed the same features which made them attractive. It offered, obviously, a social life and a literary life and cultural activities and enrichments of all sorts. It offered its members medical assistance and sick pay if they were in their insurance, if they fell ill and couldn't work. It offered a burial plot. All of this was paid for by the dues that members paid in. So it was like other sick benefit organizations, but with much more attached, because it had a fundamental ideology, which was frankly communist or communist-leaning, at least in its ideals. Some of its leaders, perhaps most of them, in the executive committee of this organization were themselves members of the Communist Party. And there was something of a novelty in that they organized themselves into branches by gender. So men's branches and women's branches. And I think this was inspired by the ideal that it was attributed to the Soviet Union of liberation of women towards complete equality, social equality. It offered a place where people of like mind could meet and talk and enjoy company. And in that sense, it was something very unsurprising to find right across Canada in all sorts of societies, all sorts of immigrant backgrounds. You find similar societies.
I was never a Communist Party member, nor was the UJPO, even though, oh, yeah, you bunch of communists. Well, yeah, they were communists there, but so what? Nothing that we did, there was nothing that we did in this country that had anything to do with what was going on over there. Excuse me, organizing unions, defending working people, fighting racism. The things that I was doing, the people around me were doing, they stand the test of time.
The people who represent, the famous people who represent this communist strand would be someone like Fred Rose, who was a member of parliament in the mid to late 40s, Becky Buhay and her brother Michael. Lea Roback is often someone who's kind of put into that mix.
So Lea Roback was a trailblazing feminist labor organizer, communist, and peace activist. She was born to a Jewish immigrant family in 1903 in Montreal. But there were several pivotal moments in her life that would essentially prepare her to become the activist and the labor organizer that she would become in later years. So Leah, somebody who remained active in labor movement and feminist movement, and in the pursuit of social justice. Her activism spans 7 decades. So she saw pretty much every important moment in the left throughout the 20th century. She was always somebody who, from a young age, as she would say, and as her detractors and her admirers would say, she had a big mouth. Elle avait la grande gueule. So she was not someone who would ever withhold her criticism, or, she was never unwilling to speak her mind, which oftentimes meant that her employment was rather short-lived. She was a fixture in marches and on protests well into her 80s and 90s. She never retired from that commitment. That was a lifelong commitment, and it was something that she also was not one to ever to identify one particular moment. It's interesting because she was somebody who was never one who would rest on her laurels of past accomplishments. She was always adapting and evolving with changing times and with changing concerns, and always very open to looking at who are the present day people who are being marginalized. Where is my attention and my activism best needed now? And so I think that that's a very interesting lesson that she provides, is that idea of always remaining engaged, but always being open to new ideas and to learning more, and to not allowing your activism to become fossilized. While she was born in Montreal and really in the heart of the immigrant Jewish community, steps away from Saint Laurent Boulevard in the Main, at the age of around 2 years old, her family decides to move to the town of Beauport, which is just outside of Quebec City. And it was a town that was Catholic, Francophone, and the Roback family, when they arrived there, are the first and only Jewish family in this village. And that really would become a really pivotal moment in preparing Leah later on in life to be able to build bridges between communities. She ends up spending her formative years from the age of around 2 years old until she's 15, living in this, immersed in this traditional French-Canadian rural setting. And because of that experience, she is, exposed to a culture. She's exposed not only to the language, but also to understanding the cultural background of, traditional early 20th century Quebec society, something that very few other Jewish, members of the Jewish community would be exposed to. When the family returns back to Montreal, when she's 15, she then is exposed to other different types of, forms of witnessing social and economic inequalities. When she returns to Montreal and she starts to work at the British American Dye Works, she's not actually working as a factory worker in that job, but she is working at the front desk, sort of in the reception. But it does allow her to have contact with the people who are coming in, who are bringing in dresses, these ball gowns that are needing to be repaired. But it highlights to her the social and class divisions and inequalities that exist in Montreal society. Here you have these workers coming in. It's oftentimes what would be referred to as la bonne, the maid, the housekeeper, or the drivers coming in, and they're bringing in dresses that belong to the upper class, the elite, the bourgeoisie of Montreal society. And she's witnessing, looking at these dresses that most likely cost what the working class would make in a year. And so, that's another just example that highlights social, class divisions along, not only class divisions, but how they also fall along language lines and along religious lines as well. But even more importantly in that job is just her exposure, her ability to start to talk one-on-one with the working class. She's also kind of a Francophile. She loves French literature, French theater, French, performance. And so she, in 1927, decides to go and study French literature in Grenoble, in France. And, it's an excellent experience, but it doesn't quite live up to what she had hoped it would be. And so shortly thereafter, by 1929, she actually decides to move to Berlin. And that's the next, I'd say, the pivotal moment in her life as a left-wing activist. She joins her brother, her older brother, Harry, who was studying medicine in Berlin. And once she's in Berlin, that's her exposure to seeing, this is a pivotal time in history of the economic, Great Depression, but also the rise of fascism. And she's witnessing that the only really legitimate response that she's seeing to this rise of fascism is from the Communist Party. And so that's where she first develops her interest in the kind of actions that they're taking on the streets. She participates in the May Day demonstrations and witnesses police brutality against the left. But this sort of solidifies her political convictions. She said it was a baptism by fire when she decides to join the Communist Party. She ends up officially joining the Communist Party in Berlin in 1931. And so she's immersed in the ideology. There's a lot of education about the issues.
But they didn't expect something from you, let us say, to further their cause. He was a Canadian who could possibly be helpful.
No, I didn't mix in their politics. I told them I came here to study the language, the history. I said, that's why I came here. Ach, wie schön. Wirklich, Fräulein Roback. And it was. So I came here not as a French Canadian, English Canadian, Jewish. I came here as a Canadian. Sie ist Kanadierin. And had I said I was Jewish, then, of course, I had said, ich bin eine Kanadierin, aber ich bin eine Jüdin. No, it would have been grässlich. So I just said, ich bin Kanadierin, and ça marche.
They didn't try to convert you?
No.
The students?
No. They would talk about their politics. We discussed that. But I told them, das ist nicht für mich. Ich bin nicht interessiert. But I used to get the Rote Fahne. I got that regularly. And I used to go to the communist meetings, because at that time I was red.
Shortly thereafter, though, obviously the context, the political climate is becoming increasingly hostile. There's Hitler is coming into power. As a Jewish woman and a member of the Communist Party and a foreigner, her friends and her comrades in the movement very quickly let her know that she really should be leaving and that she should take this opportunity to return to Canada. And she's very resistant at first. She's somebody who is very tenacious. She is fearless. She always wants to be on the front lines and fighting against injustice. But she quickly realizes that she has to return to Canada. And so when she returns, she's now coming with all of this ideological baggage. She's fully immersed in the movement in the Communist Party. She arrives back into Montreal, which is now also quite different than the Montreal, and certainly the Montreal Jewish community that she had left in the 1920s. She's arriving back at a time when there is rampant poverty and unemployment and major suffering, but also at the same time, because of the dire circumstances, there's also a groundswell of support for various different left-wing movements. And so you see that she's able to return to a Montreal and a Jewish left-wing Montreal that's very already actively engaged. And that's when she joins into the activities and the organizing that's taking place here by the Communist Party here in Montreal and in Quebec. And immediately, meets somebody like Fred Rose, who at the time was the leader of the Quebec division of the Communist Party. And so it's right away back into the heart of the action. And she's, helping out with different activities, organizing for not only, her network that she gets involved with are involved in the Communist Party, but at the time the Communist Party is illegal. Everything is being done clandestinely. And so all of these different movements they're all interrelated. Like anybody who was involved in the left at that time was in some way involved, and there were intersections between these different groups. It wasn't simply the Communist Party, or if you identified as being a socialist or an anarchist.
But let's talk about a famous luminary who came to Montreal. Emma Goldman, the most dangerous woman in America. As she was called by J. Edgar Hoover, exiled from the United States. People often know her. If they've watched the movie Reds, they know all about Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman comes to Montreal in 1908. And she writes afterwards, she came to this city, Montreal. It's horrible. It's dark. It's cold. It's priest-ridden. The Catholic Church runs everything. But there is one hope in Montreal. And what is that? It's the influx of masses of Jewish immigrants who, wherever they go in their travels in the world, bring with them the class struggle and the struggle for revolution. Emma Goldman, by the way, visits Montreal very, very frequently. And she gives speeches. This is also part of Jewish left history in Montreal during the Depression on the corner of Mount Royal and St. Lawrence, 9 Mount Royal West, to be more specific. There was all the left-wing organizations and the various Jewish mutual aid societies, sick benefit societies, you name it, they all open up a Jewish soup kitchen for the unemployed. This becomes a Jewish cooperative kitchen. Okay, you don't have to be Jewish to go in. You can get a very cheap kosher meal there so that everybody should feel free to eat, religious or non-religious. The interviewer says, you interview her, you think the only thing she's interested, her main interest in life is Jewish culture, Jewish life, the future of the Jews, the past of the Jews, etc., etc., etc. Most people on the outside don't know this. They're not aware of it. She used to lecture in Montreal, giving lectures in Yiddish literature as a way of making a little money. And one of her great friends in Montreal, who organized a testimonial dinner on her behalf in 1937, was none other than Rabbi Harry Joshua Stern, the rabbi of the Temple Emmanuel. And at this testimonial dinner, he said that his great friendship with Emma Goldman taught him that you could have excellent values even if you don't believe in God. And she responded that her great friendship with Rabbi Stern taught her that you could have excellent values even if you do believe in God.
There is a delineation. There's a frontier. There's a border which is basically in the 50s that we relate to this world and we understand rather easily what took place from the 50s on after World War II. But what took place before World War II or before the 50s requires serious research because it's a very, very different society from the one we know now. Although it's the same Montreal, it's the same Canada, it's the same families, it's the same communities. Well, one thing that's very important about the political landscape in Montreal in the 30s is this was the Great Depression. So the unemployment rate in Montreal was around 30%. Today it's about 4 or 5%. So you can imagine if you multiply the unemployment rate by 8 to 10 times, imagine what it does in terms of isolation, poverty, and despair. These were very, very difficult years, 1929 to 1939, for everyone, everywhere.
But in the 1920s and 30s, when you have the Depression, things which have been slightly improving start to get really worse. The exploitation becomes even worse. The wages are lower and lower. The piecework is heavier and heavier. And at the same time, you have the rise of fascism in Europe with its adherents as well in Canada, and especially openly in the province of Quebec. And this becomes so you have a desire on the part of all Jews to fight fascism, and especially the working class Jews to fight the terrible exploitation of the capitalist system in the 1930s.
The period from the mid-19th century to right into the 20th century, up to and including the First World War and the 1920s and 30s, this was a period of the growth of nationalisms everywhere. And in European history, it led to, of course, a series of wars and 2 world wars. Empires, multinational empires, disappeared. National states, driven by, in most cases, a very extreme self-identifying national consciousness, led by nationalist intellectuals mostly. These were the heirs to a Europe and to a West that had looked upon itself as a single civilization. And the process of crystallization of nations everywhere continues after the Second World War, and we see it still going on.
You know, even to this day, when I think of it, how could that have happened? Brilliant people, heads of scientists and everything. People were afraid. They didn't speak up. And you know, it can happen here too. It can happen in any country where there are mixed nationalities.
The Jewish community at that time was just immersed in all of these various different left-wing movements. And so that's where she's returning to Montreal and getting involved in that. And because of her her connection that she forms with Fred Rose, she is then, they develop not only a partnership in terms of their activism and as fellow comrades, but a real genuine friendship. And so when he decides to run for his first campaigns, initially they were unsuccessful, but he tries in 1935 to run for in the federal election. And then the next year in the provincial election, he asks Leah to be his campaign manager. And again, what he's identified in her are those skills that were very much a result of the trajectory of her life. She's somebody who is perfectly at ease in Yiddish, in English, and in French. She's somebody who's well-versed in all of the political terminology, and she has the consciousness of somebody, of a good Communist Party member. But also she's somebody who's fearless, who's somebody who's not afraid to stand on the street corner, hand out pamphlets, go door to door and canvass. And so she's the perfect fit, just out of her, by her nature too.
The Communist Party of Canada was outlawed in 1919. So that remained until the war, because during the war, the USSR and the Allies, of course, were fighting against the Nazis together. So that cooled down the relationship and the hostility to communism. But in the interwar period, there's a great deal of hostility to communism everywhere in Canada, except among those who often are of foreign origins, which is one of the criticisms that were leveled against them, Jews and non-Jews, who brought with them these notions from Europe when they migrated.
It's sort of funny, like my aunt and uncle were communists. My parents, they really weren't into politics. They just weren't. But they were immigrants, and there was something about the comfortableness of the values of the left that I think attracted them so much that even though everyone was scared during the 50s, they still sent me to Camp Kinderland, which was investigated, by the way, by the House Un-American Activities Committee. So how did I actually have a lot of respect for people who have to think this through and go to the left. I grew up in the left. This is what it was. So I didn't have to make that leap.
In Canada, in the 1930s, the Communist Party, specifically the Communist Party, became the main party of Jews. In the 1930s, with the rise of fascism, it often seemed to Jews that the communists were the real ones who were standing up to defend the Jews. Among the Jews here in Montreal, which I alluded to earlier, you had a by-election in 1943 where the communist candidate Fred Rose won. Just like in the provincial elections in the Jewish area, the communist candidate J.B. Salzberg won in the provincial elections. Everywhere in the metropolitan centers, the communists were becoming the main Jewish party. Not only did the communists had succeeded in showing the Jews that not only are they the main group to fight for working class issues, and they presented practical things. They stopped talking about socialism, what the future would look like, just certain things. Let's propose this kind of legislation. Let's propose a law against anti-Semitism. Let's propose a law about the minimum wage.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was one of the worst industrial disasters that happened in the United States. It was took place in 1911 in March in New York, and the fire caused the deaths of almost 150 garment workers, mostly women, who died mainly not just from the fire but also smoke inhalation, or there were people who also jumped to their deaths. Most of the victims were Italian or Jewish immigrants, aged 14 to 23. The factory employed about 500 workers. They worked 9 hours a day on weekdays, 7 hours on Saturdays, earning between $7 and $12 a week for 52 hours of work. Smoking was prohibited in the factory, but some of the cutters were known to sneak cigarettes and exhaled the smoke through their lapels to avoid detection. So, there had been some suspicion that maybe the fire had been caused by a lit cigarette. And the New York Times, I think there was an article that suggested the fire had been started by engines running the sewing machines. I don't know that they ever actually found out for sure how it was caused. One of the controversies arose when it was discovered that even though the floor where the fire happened had a number of exits, including freight elevators and a fire escape, all the doors were locked, so nobody could get out. And this was said later on to have happened for two reasons. One was to prevent theft by the workers, and the other was the locked doors allowed managers to check the women's purses when the workday ended. And other historians also conjectured that the doors were locked because the management wanted to keep the union organizers out of the factory floors. The owners were two Jewish immigrants, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. They survived the fire by fleeing to the building's roof when it began. They were later indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter. The trial was in December of 1911, and they were eventually acquitted after a long trial. This was a major milestone in Jewish labor history, and has been written about considerably in the literature of union history. The fire led to at least one major government organization instituting rules and legislation about safety standards in factories, and initiated a sort of a new history in the evolution of workers' rights in the United States that became a model for subsequent events and incidents that are sort of covered under the aegis of labor history. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union had established, between 1910 and 1911, they'd established several Canadian locals in Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg. They'd won early gains. They had the road to unionizing garment workers in Canada was long. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, the ACWA, it was reported that only about a quarter of the workers in the needle trades had unionized by the 1920s. And in contrast, half of the entire workforce had unionized by 1937.
So at this point, the ILGWU is looking to try to make a campaign to attempt to enter, to come in and bring the union into Montreal's garment industry, which at that point, despite the fact that Montreal was the capital of clothing production in all of Canada, the unions were having a tremendous amount of difficulty in successfully reaching the workers and getting their foot in the door into that industry, because they were faced with the problems of, well, for one, a political and a religious and a social climate that was quite hostile towards unionization, but also because they were faced with a workforce, particularly in the dress industry, that was primarily female, about 80% female, but also predominantly French-Canadian Catholic. And that was the workforce that the left-wing international unions that were mostly run and organized by Eastern European Jewish left-wingers were not really able to successfully bridge that gap. There was this over years, and in fact decades, they had been making small inroads into the industry, but it was mostly limited to the Jewish workforce. It's during this time, and there are different variations on the exact story, but it was either directly Fred Rose or it was Ted Allen, who was a member of the Communist Party and also a writer and journalist, who apparently was the one who first brings Leah to the attention of Rose Pizzota, who is the vice president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union.
In Canada, there was a a strike at Eaton's, the department store, in 1912. This was in Toronto. This was the first major strike action that was conducted by the International Lady Garment Workers Union here in Canada. Specifically, what happened was that in 1912, 65 men who worked as machine operators sewing coats refused to follow new orders to complete finishing work. And the owner, Timothy Eaton, demanded, without offering an increase in pay, some fairly substantial, production that just the men would refuse to do. So there was a strike. And it was effective in Toronto's immigrant Jewish community. And this actually formed a backdrop to what happened in the fall of 1936, when the ILGWU began to organize workers here in Canada, in Toronto, Winnipeg, and Montreal. The workforce here was almost entirely female, in numerous sweatshops where the conditions were just horrible.
The men who were the tailors and the cutters, and who they themselves were already well-versed in these movements, so that wasn't where the challenge lay. And then the Jewish women who were in the industry, that was also not a challenge. The challenge really was in trying to successfully reach and recruit the French-Canadian Catholic female workforce. And for years, that had been considered to be simply impossible. They would say whether it was the unions or even whether it was the government of Quebec or the Catholic Church, they would all just say that those women, the French-Canadian women, were not organizable. And so it was somebody like Rose Pizzota who said, no, this is something that we can do, and we have to do it. We have to get our foot in there.
It becomes relevant here. The union had dispatched a woman by the name of Rose Pizzota, who was a union organizer from New York, but she didn't speak any French. And Leah was the ideal person to help out Rose Pizzota. She played a key role because she was able to speak to the Francophone women in their own language. The French-speaking women constituted about 60% of all the workers. There were about 5,000 workers.
If she was there as a worker, they told her, c'est 6 piastres par semaine. And then it went up to, when they heard that there was a union, on va donner 7 piastres par semaine. Well, we were asking 11. And they sent this Rose Pizzota, she was a wonderful organizer, a Ukrainian Jewess, but she always said she was Spanish because at that time, Jews, not so kosher. So she'd say, Pizzota? Her name was, I don't know, Pruschnitz or something. Pizzota, knew. And Rose Pizzota said, we're going to organize. And I knew about unions. I said, it's about time. She says, will you help us? I said, sure I will. I did.
These were women that she knew. She could relate to them. These were women that were just the same as her friends during her childhood or the neighbors that she grew up around. And so she is identified and approached and hired to be the director of education for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And that's starting in 1936. And she would play a really instrumental role during the subsequent months of their campaign, leading up to what I would argue is one of the, or deserves to be recognized as one of the most important strikes in Quebec labor history, which is the dressmakers' strike of 1937, or often also referred to as the Midinette strike. And it's would become the largest strike of female workers in Quebec history and would remain so for decades to come.
And after about 3 weeks, they signed a collective agreement. The strikers celebrated their victory, but a year later, the contract was broken in the face of anti-communist purges that were more common, I guess, in the 1930s here in Montreal. Leah, in particular, left the garment workers in 1939, but she continued the struggle to improve the conditions of working women throughout the rest of her life, through the 40s and on.
But it is the first successful attempt by an international union, or a union that the detractors would often refer to as a Jewish union or a communist union, even though they absolutely were not that far left. But it's their first time that a secular, a neutral union from, that was easily be able to be dismissed as just being, a threat that comes from the Jews and the communists and the outsiders, actually manages to convince thousands of French-Canadian workers to join and to go on strike, and they're successful. So it's a really monumental moment in, I would argue, not only in labor history and certainly not limited in its impact to the garment industry, but that really paved the way for important gains in the labor movement across all different sectors. It also paved the way for many important gains in terms of women's rights.
Going through Leah's materials, the first thing that popped into my head was the personal is political, which is usually associated with second wave feminism. And when you talk about Leah, I think that there's no way that you can disconnect this idea of the personal is political from Leah, because she was second wave feminism before that even became an idea in the 60s, right? She was this person who knew that the way that a woman was confined or was operating in her own sphere, in her home, in her domesticity, how she was in the workplace, those were all kind of viewed as women's things, but not necessarily political, which is of course not true. And when you look through Leah's collections, you can see this very intimately, because she was very close to her family, but she understood that a woman's reproductive health was directly consequential to her own personal happiness, but also to the way that she interacted with the world around her. And that as a communal group, women had all of the same types of personal problems that they were facing. And so her collection is the very definition of the personal is political. And you see that through everything that she does in her work. Trying to understand how important she was to so many people, but just the sheer magnitude of will that this woman must have had to be able to connect with so many different communities the way that she did is just amazing, still to this day. Because at the time that she was within the labor movements, at the time that she became, when she was in Germany in 1929 and joined the Communist Party, and coming back to Montreal and still working for the Communist Party, but also working with the YWHA and helping women with education and with trying to better themselves. Throughout all of this, she was able to move seamlessly. So I'm like rambling because she just is so amazing. But in terms of historical perspective, I think people need to understand just how both divided different aspects of the daily life was for people. Because we had so many different groups at the time living within Montreal and trying to make themselves a life within the immigrant groups, but also just the perspective of how unusual that was for people to be able to do that. Just the fact that she could move seamlessly between French and English and Yiddish and German, and was involved with communism, but was also involved with sex education for women, and was also involved with the abortion rights, and was also involved with supporting Indigenous women at one point. So it's the fact that she could do this. It cannot be understated just how amazing it was that she was able to do that.
I think that history is one that we, in which our history as a Jewish community is very much a part of our collective history as contributing to modern Quebec society. So the Jewish left is something that unfortunately with time has receives very little attention, certainly in how history is taught in our schools and how it is talked about in the public discourse. But when you look at, oftentimes, certainly in Quebec, when we look back of what was the pivotal moment when things changed in Quebec society, when we shifted from the great darkness, la grande noirceur of the past and into a more progressive and open society, everybody identifies the Quiet Revolution as, oh, that was the moment when everything changed. But in essence, the roots of the Quiet Revolution can be traced even further back. It didn't just start there, and you can trace its roots back even to these early movements that were brought, that were very much present in the early Jewish immigrant community of Montreal at the time.
Recollections at the JPL is a production of the Jewish Public Library Archives and Special Collections. Additional production, editing, and operations by Ellen Belshaw and Ezell Carter. Research support from Leah Graham, Sam Pappas, and Andy Paul. Mixing by Ezell Carter and mastering by Josh Boguski.
Musical score by Danielle Zambo. Sound effects provided by Pixabay and the JPL Archives.
Thank you to our sponsors, the Azrieli Foundation and Federation CJA.
You can find out more about this podcast and all of our other happenings at jpl-curates.org or sign up for our Archives and Special Collections newsletter, Der Sammler.
You've been listening to Recollections with the JPL. This is Ellen Belshaw
and Ezell Carter
signing off.
Solidairement. Solidairement. Is that how we're saying it? Say it together.
Solidairement?
Oh, I can't do that.
You just did it.
No, I can't.
Okay. Solidairement.
Okay, do it one more time.
I'm trying
Give it
to
to me one
undo
more
it a
time.
bit. Solidairement.
Solidairement.
Solidairement. Solidairement.
Solidairement.